In the spring of 1889, in the Cypress Hills of the Northwest Territories, a man sold his son's widow for a team of mules and $20 in Dominion notes. Her name was Adeline Marchand. She was 27 years old, 8 months gone with child, and she had not spoken a word aloud since a fever took her voice at the age of 12. Her father-in-law told the freighters she was not idle, that she had never been idle, and he said it the way a man describes a horse he is trying to move before winter. She was put up on the wagon box with a rope around her wrists. She was counted, the way freight is counted. What Josiah Marchand did not know was that a horsebreaker named Gideon Ashcroft was riding the ridge 2 miles north, looking for a mare that had wandered off in the thaw, and that Gideon would come down through the poplars and find blood in the snow and follow it, because he was the sort of man who could not leave a question lying in the open. And when he found her, he would not claim her. He would not name a price. He would give her a fire, a roof, a pencil, and then, the hardest thing of all, the room to walk away from him if she wanted to. What happened between them in the 10 days that followed is worth the telling. The snow had come late that year, the way it sometimes does out there. March had gone soft, the coulees running with meltwater, the willows going red at the tips. And then on the 21st the sky turned the color of dishwater, and it began again, a heavy wet snow that clung to everything and made the world look unfinished. The trade was done in a coulee bottom, out of the wind, half a mile off the freight trail. Josiah had chosen the place for the same reason a man chooses a corner of a barn. Not for shelter, for privacy. Adeline stood with her back against the wagon wheel. Her wrists were bound in front of her with a length of picket rope, and the rope was not there because anyone thought she would fight. It was there because Josiah could not stand to look at her hands hanging free while he did what he was doing. She was wearing her mother's coat. It had been a good coat once, dark wool with horn buttons, and it had fit her fine 2 winters ago. Now it would not close over her belly, and the cold came in through the gap in a steady, patient way, settling low in her back where the ache already lived. She did not look at the freighters. She had learned young that looking invited talk, and talk about her was never talk to her. Men's things in front of her that they would not have said in front of a dog, because a dog might at least bark. There were 3 of them. 2 were young and bored. The third, the one who did the paying, was a squat man named Rufus Kettle, who hauled hides and whatever else would ride in a wagon between Maple Creek and the American line. He had a face like something left too long in the weather. Josiah stood a little apart. He kept his hat pulled low and his boots planted wide, as though the wind were pushing him and not the thing he was about to do. He talked quickly. He talked about the winter kill, about the cattle he had lost in the drifts along Battle Creek, about how a man cannot run an outfit on hope. He said the words hard year 4 times. He said them like a man laying planks over a hole. Kettle looked past him at Adeline, at her belly. You didn't mention that. Josiah shrugged. It was a small movement and it cost him nothing, and it was the worst thing he did that day. She's not idle, he said. Never was. Adeline felt the word idle go into her like a splinter. Not the rope, not the cold, the word. A man could stand there in the snow and reduce a person to whether or not they were useful, and no one in the coulee thought it strange. Kettle grunted. He walked a slow half-circle around her, the way he would around a mule he suspected of being wind-broken. He looked at her boots, which were her husband's boots, and too large. He looked at her hands, cracked at the knuckles. He looked at her mouth. She's the one that don't talk? Fever, Josiah said. When she was a girl. Nothing wrong with her hearing. Huh. Kettle nodded slowly, as though this were a point in her favor. Quiet's not the worst thing in a wagon. Then he reached into his coat and counted out the notes, and Adeline heard the small sound of paper being handled, and the heavier sound of the mules being untied from the tailgate and led forward, hooves punching through the crust. The whole transaction took less time than it takes to boil coffee. Something in her went very still. It was not grief. Grief has heat in it. This was the sensation of a lamp being carried out of a room she was still standing in. She thought about Elias. Her husband had been dead 14 months. He had gone through the ice at the crossing below the ranch, chasing a heifer that was not worth it, and she had been the one to find his hat on the shore. He had been a gentle man with a stammer and a bad chest, and he had never once, in 6 years, spoken to her as though her silence were a defect. Josiah had never forgiven his son for marrying a woman who could not answer him back. Not blood, Josiah had said once, at the table, when he thought she had gone out. She was never blood. Kettle took her arm above the elbow. His glove was stiff and smelled of tallow. He turned her toward the wagon box, and the canvas cover snapped once in the wind, loud as a hand clap. That was when the child moved. Not the slow turning she had grown used to over the winter, the lazy roll under her ribs that came in the small hours. This was a blow. Sharp, low, urgent, driven from the inside like a fist against a door. It emptied her lungs. Her bound hands flew to her belly, and she bent forward over them, and the second kick came before she had drawn breath from the first. Kettle swore and let go of her arm. Something came loose inside her chest, and it was not fear and it was not hope. It was refusal. It arrived whole and quiet and absolute, and it had the shape of a single word she had not been able to say aloud in 15 years. No, the near mule, spooked by the shouting, threw its head. The wagon rocked. The rope she was tied to had been looped around the brake handle rather than knotted properly. A small laziness, the kind of thing men do when they are ashamed and hurrying, and the loop rode up and slipped free. Adeline moved. She wrenched sideways. The rope burned across her wrists, hauled through the iron cleat on the wagon box, and the cleat's edge opened her right ankle above the boot top. A clean, deep gash. She did not feel for several seconds. She came off the box hard, went to one knee in the snow, and then she was up and running, and the blood was already coming, warm, soaking through her stocking, laying down a bright thread behind her that she never once thought to look at. Behind her, shouting, a whip cracking on nothing. One of the young freighters laughed, that startled bark men give when the world does something they did not authorize. Someone called out Josiah's name once, and Josiah did not answer. The poplars took her in. They stood close together on the coulee's north slope, gray and wet, and the branches raked her face and caught her hair and pulled it loose from its pins. She fell the first time within 100 yards. Snow went into her mouth, gritty and bitter with old leaves, and she got up. She fell again at the top of the rise and got up again. The child kicked, and she pressed her hand flat against her belly and made the only sound she could make, a raw shape of breath in her throat that meant, as clearly as any word ever meant anything, "I hear you. I'm going." The blood ran into her boot. Each step she took set down a red coin on the white. And the snow kept falling, and the snow began, very slowly, to cover them. She ran until running was stumbling. She stumbled until stumbling was crawling. The ground gave out from under her at the head of a washout where meltwater had cut back into the bank. She went over the lip, struck the frozen gravel below with her shoulder and her hip, and lay there with the breath knocked clean out of her while the snow came down through the branches, soft, indifferent, thorough. Night came the way it comes in that country. Not gradually, like a lid. Adeline lay curled at the bottom of the cut, with one arm wrapped under her belly, and the cold worked into her the way water works into a boot. Fingers first, then her feet. Then it found the small of her back and settled there. The pain in her ankle faded, and she understood, in a distant, unhurried way, that this was not a good sign. Everything grew soft-edged. The wind above her sounded like a room full of people talking in another house. She pressed her palm to her belly. Waited. The child stirred, weak, but there. She thought about her mother, who had been a Rook before she married, and who had braided Adeline's hair by lamplight and had never once treated her daughter's silence as a punishment God had handed down. Her mother had taught her letters patiently on a slate, because her mother had understood something that Josiah Marchand never would, that a person who cannot speak is not a person who has nothing to say. Snow gathered on her coat. It gathered in the folds of her sleeve. It settled on her lashes and stayed. Somewhere up the slope, far off she thought, she saw a smear of light. She dragged herself 2 feet forward on her elbows before her arms quit. She lay still. She kept her eyes on the light. She did not know what she was asking for, or whom she was asking. The snow went on covering the red thread she had left through the poplars, coin by coin, until there was nothing there at all. Gideon Ashcroft had been out since noon, and he was cold, and he was in the sort of mood that comes over a solitary man when a good mare goes through a fence, and he must spend a fine day undoing someone else's carelessness. He was 41. He had come up from the Qu'Appelle country 9 years back, and, before that, from somewhere in Ontario he did not speak of. And he broke horses for the ranches along the Cypress Hills bench and wintered alone, in a line camp above Bear Coulee, that had been built for 2 men, and had never held more than one. He talked so seldom that people in Maple Creek assumed he was proud. He was not proud. He had a stammer, mild, the kind that only ever caught him on the words he most wanted to say, and 30 years of it had taught him that silence cost less than the alternative. He had learned to say what needed saying and stop. He found the first blood at the top of the poplar slope, and he found it because his horse would not walk over it. Gideon swung down. He crouched, pulled off a glove, and brushed the fresh snow aside with 2 fingers. It was not much. A dark smear, already stiffening, going brown at the edges. His first thought was game. A wolf kill, a deer that had gone down. He looked for the sign of it, the drag, the scatter, the hair. There was none. He straightened and looked at the ground the way he looked at a horse he did not yet understand, and he read it. The blood came in a line, not a spray, not a pool, a line, 1 mark every 3 or 4 feet, the spacing of a stride. A short stride, a person's stride, a person who was not running well, and the tracks over top of it were only her own. Nothing had chased her past this point. Whatever had chased her had turned back at the coulee lip. And that told Gideon more than the blood did, because men do not turn back from a thing they are hunting for meat. They turn back from a thing they think will finish itself off without them. Not game, he said out loud to the horse, and his own voice surprised him. He followed. He did not hurry. Hurrying loses sign. The trail went the wrong way. It went away from the freight trail, away from the ranches, away from every reasonable thing, straight up into broken country where a person had no business in a wet March storm. That was the part that put a cold hand on the back of his neck. People only run that direction when what is behind them is worse than the country ahead. He found her boot print filled with a red rim at the edge of the washout. He found where the bank had given way. Then he found her. She was half buried. The snow had made a low white ridge along the length of her body, the way it does over a thing that has stopped moving. One wrist lay exposed, and the skin of it was scoured raw in a bracelet, and Gideon had shot enough horses and pulled enough calves to know what rope does to a person who fights it. Her ankle was black with blood gone hard. Her other arm was underneath her, wrapped tight around her belly, and her fingers were dug into the wool of her coat, as though the last thing she had decided, before deciding nothing else, was that she would not let go. Gideon knelt. He put 2 fingers to her throat and held them there a long time. There, slow and far away, and there. He did not say anything. He took off his coat and he wrapped her in it, and when he lifted her she weighed less than a saddle, and something in him turned over hard and did not right itself again. The line camp was a low log building, with a sod roof and a stovepipe. Gideon had never once thought of it as anything but a place to sleep. He built the fire higher than he had built it in 6 years. He got her boots off. The left one came, the right one had to be cut. And he cleaned the gash above her ankle with hot water and lye soap and packed it and bound it with a strip torn off his own spare shirt. He wrapped her wrists. He put every blanket he owned over her, and then his buffalo coat on top of that, and then he sat down on the floor by the bunk with his back to the wall and waited. Around midnight her eyes opened. The fear that came into them was instant and total. She tried to get up. Her hand went to her belly first, and only after that to the blanket, and only after that did she look at him. Gideon did not move. He sat where he was, on the floor so that his head was lower than hers. "You're all right," he said. "Nobody here but me." She stared at him. She was looking for something in his face. He knew what it was. He had seen the same searching look in the eye of a horse that had been badly used, that quick flick of the gaze across a man's hands, checking for what he was carrying. Gideon showed her his hands, palms up empty, and then he put them on his knees. "There's stew," he said. "It'll keep." She lay back down. She did not sleep for a long while, neither did he. But sometime before dawn her breathing changed and lengthened, and he let his own eyes close. He did not ask her a single question that night, not her name, not who had tied her, not who the child belonged to. He had learned a long time ago that questions are a kind of debt, and she owed nobody anything. She woke to the smell of wood smoke and coffee and something else, barley and onion and the memory of meat. For a moment she did not know where the warmth ended, and she began. Then the ache in her ankle arrived, and behind it the ache in her hip, and behind that faintly, the child turning over. She opened her eyes. Log walls, chinked with clay, a stove with a bent pipe, a window no bigger than a book, running with condensation, a rifle on 2 pegs, and beside it, on the same wall, a woman's shawl on a nail, faded to no color at all, and in the corner, taking up more room than anything else in the cabin, a loom. It was a floor loom, big, made of poplar and pegged, not nailed. There was cloth on it, perhaps 1.5 feet of it, dove gray with a red thread running through, and the shuttle lay across the warp where somebody had set it down. Dust had settled in the shed of it. Not a season's dust, years of it. Adeline looked at the loom for a long time. Gideon was at the table with his back to her, working neatsfoot oil into a bridle. He had heard her wake. He did not turn around, and she understood that he was giving her the room to decide what she wanted to do about being awake, and something in her chest loosened by 1/4 inch. She sat up. It took her 3 tries. He heard it and came with a bowl and set it on the stool within her reach, and then he stepped back 2 paces, which was as far back as the cabin allowed. "Eat it slow," he said. She ate it slow. Not because he said so, because she had learned. In 14 months under Josiah's roof, that food eaten quickly is food noticed. When the bowl was empty, she set it down and looked at him and tapped her fingers twice against her throat, then shook her head. It was the gesture she had used all her life, and half the people she used it on thought it meant she was simple. Gideon watched her do it. He nodded once, the way a man nods at a fact about the weather. Then he got up, went to the shelf above the stove, and came back with a stub of lead pencil and a page torn out of the back of a stud book, and he put them on the blanket by her hand. Adeline looked at the pencil. Then she put her face in her hands and cried without making a sound. Her shoulders going, the whole of her folding around it, and Gideon Ashcroft turned around and went outside and split kindling in the snow for 20 minutes, though he had kindling enough for a week. When he came back in, the paper had 1 word on it in a clear, schooled hand, Adeline. He looked at it a while. Then he said, "Gideon," and he pointed at himself, and he felt like a fool doing it, and she almost smiled. That was the whole of their conversation for the first day. On the second day, she wrote more. She wrote it in pieces over the course of the afternoon, and he read each piece as she finished it, standing across the room with the paper held at arm's length like a man reading a summons. "My husband died last winter. His name was Elias. His father says I am not blood. He sold me for 2 mules and $20 to freighters. I heard the money." Gideon read that last one twice. He set the paper down on the table and stood with his knuckles on either side of it and looked at the wall for a while. She watched him and thought, here it comes, because there was always a price, in her experience. The men who helped you and the men who hurt you were often the same men, and the bill came due whenever they decided it should. He turned around. "You can stay till you're strong," he said. "That's all that is. There's no other part to it," she wrote. "Why?" Gideon looked at the word for a moment. Then he looked at the loom in the corner, and away from it. "Because a woman isn't freight," he said. That night the wind came up out of the northwest, and the snow with it, and Adeline lay in the warm dark, listening to it hammer at the sod roof, and for the first time since the coulee she slept without dreaming that she was running. The knock came a little after dawn on the third day. One blow, flat and heavy, the way a man knocks when he has already decided the door is going to open. Gideon was on his feet before it finished. He crossed the room, and he did not pick up the rifle, but he stood where his hand could reach it, and that was a language of its own. Adeline sat up in the bunk. She did not need to be told who it was. Her hands went cold all at once, and the child went very still inside her, as though it too were listening. Gideon said low, without turning, "Don't move." He opened the door 6 inches. 3 men. Snow on their shoulders, faces scoured red. Kettle in front, and behind him the 2 young ones, and behind them, standing back by the horses with his hat in his hands, like a man at a funeral, Josiah Marchand. Kettle looked past Gideon into the cabin. He had the flat, unembarrassed stare of a man who has been let into a great many places he had no right to be. "Lookin' for a woman," Kettle said. "Come through here 2 nights back hurt. Likely. Nobody's come through here. She's paid for." Kettle said it the way another man might say it's Tuesday. There was no defiance in it. That was the horror of it. There was no defiance in it at all. "Bought fair. I've got the notes counted out of my own pocket and 2 mules gone out of my string." Gideon stood in the doorway. He did not raise his voice. He almost never had in his life, and the stammer would have caught him if he had tried. "A woman isn't freight," he said. The younger of the 2 freighters laughed. "That ain't how it was settled." "No," Gideon agreed. "It isn't." He looked past Kettle then, over his shoulder, to where Josiah stood in the snow with his hat in his hands. He looked at him for perhaps 3 seconds. Josiah found something to study on the ground. Then Gideon closed the door. He stood with his hands still on the latch, and he heard them out there, arguing, the words coming through the logs, stripped of everything but their tone. Then hoofbeats, walking, then trotting, going down the coulee. Inside, Adeline was shaking so hard the bunk frame ticked against the wall. Gideon crossed the room. He crouched by the bunk, not touching her, forearms on his knees. "They'll come back," he said, "with more of them, or with a story. Kettle want his money's worth. He stopped. He would not say father-in-law. "That man'll want it done quiet." She wrote badly, the pencil jumping. "Then I go. Not you, me." "No," Gideon said. She struck the paper with the flat of her hand. Her eyes were furious and streaming. He understood her perfectly. "You have a roof. You have a stove. You have 6 years of dust on a loom in the corner, and I will not be the reason you lose it." Gideon Ashcroft looked around the cabin, the rifle, the shawl on the nail, the loom. "It's a shack," he said. "There's 100 of them." He was lying, and they both knew it, and he stood up and started packing. He built a travois out of 2 lodgepole rails and a hide, because a sled would sink in the wet. He lashed the blankets down. He put her in the middle of them, and wrapped her until only her face showed. And then he went back inside, for one thing, and when he came out he had the shawl from the nail, folded small in his coat, and he did not explain it, and she did not ask. He led the horse out. He did not look back at the cabin. Adeline did. She saw the thread of smoke standing up straight from the pipe for a moment. And then the wind found it and tore it apart, and then the poplars closed and it was gone. The storm came at them out of the northwest across 40 miles of open country, and by afternoon there was no world left, only white, and the shapes of trees arriving out of it one at a time like accusations. Gideon walked. He led the horse and he broke trail, and the drifts came to the animal's chest in the low places. He navigated by memory and by the tilt of the ground under his boots, following a line he had ridden 9 summers before, and had no earthly reason to remember, except that a solitary man remembers everything, having nothing else to fill the space. He did not speak. Words cost breath, and breath cost heat. Behind him on the travois Adeline lay watching the snow come down out of a sky she could not see, and she thought about what it meant that a man would burn down his own life for a stranger, and not once mentioned that he was doing it. Near dusk the pain came. It came around her like a hand closing, low and total, and she made a sound. A real sound. The ragged animal noise her throat could still produce. And Gideon stopped so fast the horse threw its head. He was beside her in 3 steps, on his knees in the drift, pulling the blanket back from her face. She gripped his wrist. Her fingers had no strength in them, and she gripped it anyway. Her eyes said plainly, "Something's wrong." The pain crested and passed and left its message behind. Gideon looked at the sky, and at the light going, and at the long white nothing in every direction. "Close now," he said, which he did not know to be true. And Adeline, lying in the snow with her hand around the wrist of a man she had known 3 days, understood something she had not understood in the coulee, or in the washout, or in the 14 months of Josiah Marchand's house. She was still frightened, but she was not alone in it. Somebody had walked into the storm on purpose, on her account, with nothing to gain, and had not said one word about it. The fear did not leave her. It simply lost the power to press her flat against the ground. The cabin came out of the white when there was almost no light left. It was low and long, and there were 2 windows, and the light in them was yellow and stubborn, and the smoke came out of the chimney thick and confident, and the sight of it went into Adeline like whiskey. Gideon knocked once and pushed the door open, because in that country, in that weather, you do not stand on ceremony. The woman inside was perhaps 60. Gray hair in a single braid down her back, a red sash at her waist, hands like tree roots, and eyes that took in the horse, the travois, the blood on the blanket, and Gideon's face, in that order and in about a second and a half. Her name was Josephine Dumont. Her people had come out of the Red River country a generation back, and she had brought more children into the world in those hills than the church in Maple Creek had baptized. She did not ask a single question either. She simply began clearing the space by the fire. "You came hard," she said to Gideon over her shoulder, in the flat way of a woman assessing whether a horse has been ridden badly or ridden necessarily. "There was reason. There generally is." She jerked her chin at the far end of the room. "Get that door barred." There was another man in the cabin. He sat at the table with his boots off, and steaming by the hearth. A big fair-haired man of about 50, with a scarlet tunic hanging on a peg behind him, and on the table in front of him a bound ledger, an inkwell, and a steel-nibbed pen laid across the page to hold it flat. He was a sergeant out of the Maple Creek detachment of the Northwest Mounted Police, and his name was Alistair Rennie, and he had been 3 days riding a patrol that the storm had turned into a stay. He got up when he saw the state of her. They laid Adeline by the fire. Josephine cut away the bandage and looked at the ankle and made a small, disapproving noise that was. Gideon understood approval of the work. Adeline's story came out in pieces over the next 2 hours, on paper, in a hand that grew steadier as the warmth came back into her fingers. Josephine held the lamp. Rennie read each sheet as she finished it, and passed it to Josephine. And Josephine read it and set it face down on the table and put her hand flat on it once, before reaching for the next. Nobody hurried her. Nobody finished her sentences. It took a long time. When she stopped writing, the fire was the only sound in the room. Sergeant Rennie sat back. He looked at the pile of papers for a good while, and then he uncapped the inkwell and drew the ledger toward him and dipped the pen. "Mrs. Marchand," he said, "I want you to understand something before I write a word of this." Adeline waited. "There is no law in this dominion, Rennie said, that makes a person property. Not a woman, not a child, not anywhere in these territories, and not on any man's ranch. What was done to you in that coulee was not a bad bargain. It was not a family matter." He set the nib against the paper. "It was a crime, and it has been a crime the entire time it was happening, and it does not become a crime only now that I have heard about it." Adeline sat absolutely still. She had run for 2 miles through poplar scrub with the blood going out of her, and she had lain in a washout waiting to die, and she had been carried and warmed and fed and defended, and none of it had done what those 3 sentences did. Somebody had said it out loud, and now somebody was writing it down. Snow forgets. She had watched it, in the poplars, erasing her one red coin at a time. Ink does not forget. She reached over and turned the ledger a little toward herself, and Rennie let her, and she watched the pen move across the page, laying down the date, and the place, and the name of Josiah Marchand, and the name of Rufus Kettle, and the sum of $20, and the words 2 mules. Her breath came apart. Josephine put a hand between her shoulder blades and held it there. The storm sealed them into that cabin for 2 days. Josephine brewed things out of a canvas sack that smelled of pepper and bark and made Adeline drink them. She changed the dressing on the ankle 3 times. She talked while she worked, low, constant, mostly to herself, in French and Michif and English all braided together. And Adeline, who had lived 15 years inside her own head, found that she loved the sound of it. Rennie wrote in the mornings. He asked his questions gently and waited for the pencil, and never once raised his voice as though volume were a cure for silence. Your father-in-law's Christian name, she wrote it, Josiah Marchand. And the freighters. Names, one is Kettle. The others I don't know. That's no matter, Rennie said, and the nib scratched on. This does. Gideon kept the fire, and cleared the doorway and stayed mostly at the edge of the room. But on the second night, when Adeline was propped against the wall, and Rennie had gone out to see to the horses, and Josephine was asleep sitting up, she got the pencil and wrote something, and held it out to him across the hearth. Who made the cloth on the loom? Gideon took the paper. He turned it around in his fingers a few times. He looked into the fire. Rosalie, he said. Adeline waited. She was, of all the people in the world, the best at waiting, my wife. The stammer caught him, and he stopped and started again, and she saw what it cost him and what he thought it cost him. She wove. Her mother taught her. That loom came out from Ontario in pieces, and I put it back together wrong twice. He turned the paper over. There was nothing on the back of it. He looked at it anyway. There was a boy, he said. He came early, in February, 6 years ago, in that same cabin, and I couldn't get anybody, and I couldn't do anything, and there wasn't anybody to send for. The fire popped. They're both up on the bench, he said, under the 2 rocks. I made him a pair of shoes. He stopped. He worked his jaw, which was foolish, because he was never going to walk. But I was sitting there, and my hands wanted something to do. Adeline sat with that. Then she reached out and took the paper back from him, and she wrote, and she gave it back. You never left her loom. Gideon read it. No. You never finished the cloth. No. Neither of you was ever coming back to it. He read that one for a long time. I know, he said. She wrote one more line, and it was the last thing on the page, and it took her a while. I would have finished it, if you had asked. Gideon Ashcroft folded that paper in half, and then in half again, and he put it in the pocket over his chest, and he did not say anything at all, and it was the loudest thing that had ever happened in that room. The pain came back at 3 in the morning, and this time it did not leave. Josephine was up before Adeline had finished the first sound. She had water on, and cloth laid out, and her sleeves rolled to the elbow inside of 2 minutes, and she took Adeline's face in both hands and looked into her eyes and said, Now, it's now. You listen to me, and nothing else. Rennie went outside and stayed there, in a blizzard, for 4 hours, and never once complained about it afterwards. Gideon stood in the corner by the loom that was not there, the loom of his own place, and did not know what to do with his body. He turned to go out with Rennie. Adeline caught his sleeve. She could not say it. She looked at him. I'm here, Gideon said. I'm not going anywhere. She gripped his hand, and she gripped it for 4 hours, and afterwards there were bruises across his knuckles that lasted a week, and he was proud of them in a way he never told anyone. The wind screamed. The cabin held. Josephine talked and talked, low and steady, counting, cooking, swearing cheerfully at the fire when it smoked. And somewhere in the last hour, Adeline stopped being afraid and became simply, entirely, the work she was doing. At 6 in the morning, in the dark, a sound tore through the room that no one in it had ever heard before. A cry. Furious, ragged, absolutely certain of itself, Josephine lifted him up, red and blotched and roaring, and laid him on his mother's chest. Adeline made a sound. It was not a word. It never would be. It was low and broken, and it came out of her like something climbing up out of deep water. And it went on, and it was laughter, and it was weeping, and it was the whole of her. And Josephine Dumont, who had heard 1,000 mothers, put her sleeve to her eyes. Gideon stood at the foot of the bed and looked at the child, at the small, furious fists, at the fact of him. And he thought about 2 rocks up on the bench above bare coulee, and he found that the thought did not gut him the way it always had. It sat in him differently, as though there were room in the world for both facts at once. Morning came the way it does after a storm out there, absurdly clear, blue and enormous, the snow so bright it hurt, the smoke going straight up. Rennie sat at the table with the ledger open and the inkwell thawed by the fire. "Your name," he said, "for the record." Adeline had the pencil. She wrote Adeline Marchand, and then she stopped and looked at it, and Rennie waited. She drew a line through Marchand. Then she wrote, underneath, Rook, her mother's name, the name of a woman who had taught a silent girl her letters on a slate by lamplight and had never once acted as though it were charity. Rennie read it and nodded and copied it into the ledger in his clean official hand. "And the child?" Adeline looked down at him. He was asleep with his fist against his mouth. She thought of a gentle man with a stammer and a bad chest, dead in the ice at the crossing, who had never in 6 years spoken to her as though her silence were a defect. She wrote, Elias. Then, after a moment, Elias Rook, his father's name, not his grandfather's. Rennie set down the pen. He blotted the page. He turned the ledger around so she could see it, and he laid his flat hand on it. "This is a record," he said. "It'll be copied at Maple Creek, and again at Regina. No claim against you or this child stands anywhere in these territories. Any man who says otherwise will be explaining himself to me." Adeline wrote, "They'll come. They may try," Rennie said. "They'll get nowhere." He looked over at Gideon, who was standing in the doorway with his arms folded and the light behind him. "You did right," Rennie said. Gideon inclined his head about half an inch. He did not agree, and he did not argue, and he did not collect the compliment. It seemed to Rennie, who had spent 20 years reading men, that Gideon Ashcroft had simply never learned to think of himself as a subject worth discussing. They took Josiah Marchand at the trading post at Maple Creek 11 days later, on a Tuesday, in front of about 30 people. He did not run, that was the strange part. He was sitting on a nail keg by the stove, with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, and when Rennie came through the door in scarlet with 2 constables behind him, Josiah set the cup down carefully on the floor beside his boot, as though the last thing he owed the world was not breaking a cup. Kettle they took 2 days later at the American line, with the notes still in his coat. Adeline was there in the trading post. She had not wanted to be. Josephine had said, "Without heat, you go. You don't have to look at him. But the paper should have your hand on it in the same room as him." So she stood by the counter, with Elias against her shoulder, and Gideon stood behind her left elbow, and she watched the man who had sold her get to his feet. Josiah looked at her. He looked at the baby. Then he looked at the floor, and he said, "I'd have got her back. Before spring, I'd have gone and got her back." Nobody in that room believed him. Rennie wrote it down anyway, because it was, in its own miserable way, a confession. Josiah's voice cracked. "Addie, girl, you know what kind of winter it was." Adeline stood very still. Then she stepped forward, and Rennie turned the ledger toward her on the counter and handed her the pen, the steel nib, the inkwell, everything official and permanent and slow, and she signed her statement in front of him, Adeline Rook, and below it, because he was still talking, still explaining about the cattle and the drifts and the hard year, she wrote one more line and turned the book around so that he could read it. "I heard you count the money." Josiah Marchand stopped talking. He did not speak again all the way to the guardroom, and at the assizes in Regina that autumn he said only that he had been under a strain, and the judge, an old man with no patience left, told him that a great many people in that country were under a strain and had somehow managed not to sell anybody. Adeline did not attend. She had a child by then who was pulling himself up on the legs of a table and who had, at 7 months, the loudest laugh in the Cypress Hills. They went back to the line camp when the Chinook came through in the 3rd week of April and took the snow off the south slopes in a single warm night, the way it does out there, so that a man goes to bed in winter and wakes in mud. The cabin was as they had left it. Snow had drifted against the north wall to the eaves and was rotting now, sagging, dripping off the sod. Gideon pushed the door. It stuck and gave. Inside, everything was where it had been and cold, and smelled of ash and mice. The rifle, the 2 pegs, the nail where the shawl had hung, and the loom. Gideon set down the load he was carrying. He went and stood in front of it and looked at the shuttle lying across the warp with 6 years of dust in the shed. And Adeline stood in the doorway with Elias on her hip and watched him not touch it. Then he took the shawl out of his coat, folded small, where it had ridden against his ribs through a blizzard and a berth and 11 days in Maple Creek. He hung it back on its nail. "You don't have to stay," he said. He set it to the wall. "There's Maple Creek. There's people there. Church, and a school in 2 years, and women who'd... There's people." Adeline crossed the room and put Elias down in the blankets by the stove, and he grabbed a fistful of wool and shoved it in his mouth, and she took the pencil from the shelf where it lived, and she wrote on the back of an old feed bill. She held it out. Gideon read it. "In that house I was watched. Everything I did was weighed. Twice a day I found out what I was worth." He looked up. She lifted her chin. "Keep reading. I don't want to be watched. I don't want to be kept. I have been kept." He turned the page over. There was more on the back, and her hand was shaking a little. "I want to be asked." Gideon Ashcroft stood in the middle of his cabin, in the ash and the mouse smell, and the light coming in through a window the size of a book, and he understood that he had been given the only thing he had ever actually needed, which was permission to want something. He put the paper down on the table. "What, Adeline?" he said. It caught. He let it catch. He did not go around it. "Adeline, will you stay?" She did not write anything. She crossed the floor and took his hand. "Not the way you take a hand you are grateful to, which is with both of yours, from underneath, but the way you take a hand across a table when a bargain has been struck and both parties have got what they came for." She held it, and then she nodded once. And then, because Elias had started to fuss, and because the fire needed lighting, and because there is only so long that anybody can stand still inside a moment like that, she let go, and she went and knelt at the stove and began breaking kindling with her hands. Behind her, Gideon Ashcroft put his palm on the frame of his wife's loom and left it there and took it away and went out to see about the horses. That summer the hills came green and stayed green, which they do about 1 year in 5. Adeline cleaned the loom with a rag and a little oil. She spent 3 days puzzling out Rosalie's threading, sitting in front of it with her chin in her hand, and Elias asleep in a wash basket, and Gideon, who could not have told a warp from a weft, watched her from the doorway and did not offer to help, because she had not asked. On the 4th day the beater knocked, and knocked again, and the sound went out through the open door, and the horses looked up. She finished the gray cloth with the red thread in it. Then she cut it off the loom and washed it and hung it on the fence. And it hung there all afternoon in the wind, and neither of them said one word about whose cloth it was. And neither of them had to. They were married in Maple Creek in September by a Methodist minister who was faintly scandalized that the bride said nothing at all. And Sergeant Rennie stood up beside them with his hat under his arm. And Josephine Dumont came 80 miles with a bannock the size of a wagon wheel. The letters came in time, official ones, copies of the record, forwarded from Regina, confirming what had already been settled. Adeline read them once, at the table, in good light. Then she put them in the flour tin behind the stove, where they stayed for 30 years. The past did not go away. It did not vanish, and she never once pretended it had. It only stopped having teeth. There is a photograph, taken about 1911, that hangs now in a museum in Alberta, in a case with a card that gets a good many facts wrong. It shows an old woman sitting at a floor loom in a doorway. On the wall behind her is a faded shawl on a nail. A grown man in shirt sleeves stands to one side, unmistakably her son, holding the reins of a horse and laughing at something out of frame. And in a chair on the sunlit step, a big lean old man with white hair sits with his hands on his knees, not looking at the camera at all. He is looking at the woman. The card in the case says her name was Adeline Rook, and that she was a weaver in the Cypress Hills, and that she was mute from childhood. It does not say that she was sold once. In a coulee, in the snow, for 2 mules and $20. It does not say that she got up and ran. It does not say that a man came down through the poplars and read her blood on the ground and did not turn back. It does not say that she was never given a home, because a home cannot be given. It says only that she was a weaver, and that the cloth she made was very fine, and that she worked at that loom until the last spring of her life. Which is, when you consider it, exactly what she would have wanted written down.